friends, my name is Katherine, and today I'm doing my wrap up for October where I read a billion books. I didn't actually read a billion books, but I read a lot this month, and I'm pretty excited about it because now I won't be so behind during NaNoWriMo and feel like I'm buried under my Goodreads reading goal and my NaNoWriMo goal. So yay! But I'm just gonna jump into my wrap up and I'm gonna try to go as quickly as possible because there are a lot of books to go through. The first book that I finished this month was The Nightingale, and I loved this. This is a historical fiction that follows two different storylines of sisters during World War II in France, where the Nazis were occupying France. And it follows the two different storylines and how the two different sisters survived the war and what they did to contribute to trying to overturn the Nazi ruling in France. I felt like this book was really well paced. I felt like the details in it were very historically accurate to my knowledge, and the way that everything was handled I felt was done very sensitively. It definitely didn't cover up the horrors of World War II, especially in France with the Nazi occupation, but it also didn't kind of glamorize the horror of that. I felt like the author handled this subject very respectfully and was trying to tell a story of some of the things that did happen during the war without necessarily trying to sensationalize it. I did end up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars. I listened to it on audiobook and was engrossed the entire time. The next book that I finished was The Shadow Hour by Melissa Gray, and this is the sequel to The Girl at Midnight, and I'm not going to say too much about this because spoilers obviously, but I absolutely loved the introduction to the new villain in the story. I felt like it added so much to the story and just really drew me in. I was on the edge of my seat for a lot of it, just trying to figure out what this new villain was going to do, because in the first book we had one villain that we worried about, and then there's an introduction of a new one that we have to worry about, and it was so fantastic. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. Listen to this on audiobook, and the narrator for these audiobooks does such a good job. The next book that I read was Britt-Marie Was Here, and I picked this up because I've heard good things about it from Joss over at Squibbles Reads and Max at Well Done Books, and I was just curious and I picked this one up not knowing that it's kind of like a companion novel to the first two, which I don't think there are spoilers or anything, but this is a very character-driven novel that follows a main character named Britt-Marie who is trying to find out who she is as a person outside of her marriage, and moves to this small town and takes on a job just to try to gain some independence and kind of find who she is and figure things out. And this book was so fantastic, just exploring self-actualization and just realizing who you are outside of certain identities and how all those come together collectively was really fantastic. I loved all the side characters. This book was just the quirkiest quirk book I've ever read, and I loved every second of it. I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars and would recommend picking it up if you love character-driven stories. The next book that I read was With Malice, and yet another audiobook. I really enjoyed this one. It follows a main character who wakes up after a car accident and she has no recollection of what happened, but it turns out her best friend is dead and she's the main suspect in the murder trial. And this book just follows her trying to figure out what exactly happened. I did really enjoy this. I think that it was a pretty interesting novel. I liked how everything was coming together and the reader wasn't really sure what was happening because the main character wasn't sure what was happening. And I enjoyed how everything built up and there was pretty decent payoff in the end. I ended up giving this a 3.5 out of 5 stars because some things were a teensy tiny bit predictable, but it was still really fun to follow along. That was by Eileen Cook, by the way. The next book that I read was Conversion by Katherine Howe, and this was one of my TBR books. I was really looking forward to this one because I felt like it was going to be a very paranormal read and that would be really perfect for October. But I was a little bit wrong. This book follows two different storylines. So it follows the Salem witch trials and what actually happened, and is kind of looking into the historically accurate points of that story. And then it follows a main character in modern day times who's kind of having a similar experience with people coming down with these strange side effects and no one's quite sure what's happening. Her fellow classmates are becoming ill and they all have very different side effects coming out and everyone's just really confused. And there's just this like panic in the town about it. And if it hadn't been for the fact that I've already read a book that is very similar to this, which is The Fever by Megan Abbott, I feel like I would have enjoyed this one a whole lot more because it's a very similar premise, a lot of different underlying themes, but overall the book definitely did what it set out to do and just discuss panic and misinformation and just the way certain stories are portrayed. Thought that was really interesting, and I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I picked up was Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, and I've been so excited to get my hands on this book. I have been on the waiting list for forever at my library to get this, and it was so worth it. The wait was so worth it. I cannot even fully explain how incredible this book is. It follows multi-generations of people, but the story starts out with 2 half-sisters. One sister is sold into slavery, one sister marries a slaver, and the stories start off in Africa and just branch out with the generations, and we get to see multiple generations throughout the storyline, and I just loved the narrative that discussed racism and slavery and how generations past do affect what is happening in the present and how those issues can barrel through generations, and just the discussion on all of this was so brilliantly done and just so well put together, and the storytelling itself was beautiful. I cannot believe this is a debut novel because oh my gosh, Yaa Gyasi just writes with, oh, it's so beautiful. I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars, and I do have to say it was probably the most impactful book that I read this month, and I do recommend that anyone who watches my videos and kind of likes the same books that I do, you need to check this one out. The next book that I picked up was The Handbook for Dragon Slayers by Merrie Heskell. This book is a really cute middle grade book, which I will have a 5 reasons to read up on my channel later this month for you guys to check out. But this book follows a main character who's a princess, and she does have a disability, and she's not really sure she wants to be a princess. And she wants to make a name for herself, so she decides that she is going to write a really great book that will go down in history and be memorable, and that is The Handbook for Dragon Slayers. And this book just kind of follows her misadventures along the way, and it is just so fantastically cute and great story writing and feminism everywhere, which is awesome. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. The only thing that kept me from giving it a full 5 stars is the pacing is a little bit slower, but still so very enjoyable. The next book that I read was Bone Gap by Laura Ruby. This was a book that my friend Caitlin over at Book Chats has recommended time and time again, and it follows 2 different main characters, and it starts off with one of the main characters being abducted, and she goes missing, and everyone in the town is kind of curious as to what happened, but not curious enough to really research it, with the exception of her friend who was there when she did get abducted, and he is very much invested in finding out what happened. And the story just really follows those 2 storylines. One person trying to find the girl who's abducted, and the girl who's abducted being abducted. And it sounds like it's such a simple story, but this story has a lot of complexities to it. I really enjoyed the discussion on beauty and worth and how we put a lot of stock in women being desirable and attractive, and how that does have some dangerous undercurrents in our society, and seeing that discussion really well done was fantastic, and I very much enjoyed this audiobook. I ended up giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And I picked up The Princess Diaries by Meg Cabot, and I honestly just picked this up because I feel like I really need to read the series because I love the movies so much. And I listened to this on audiobook. It follows the main character, who's a princess, Mia, and I really enjoyed some of the differences in this book. The fact that it takes place in New York, I enjoyed that much more because I'm a sucker for New York settings. I just think they're really cool, and I thought that Mia was a really fun character. I liked how awkward and unsure of herself she was in some areas, but very dedicated in others, especially since she's like super environmentalist. Like, that was just fun to see that storyline play out. The only thing that I didn't really like about this book so much is the discussion on mental illness. It didn't address it particularly, not that any characters had a mental illness, and I did have some issues with it. I can see that it didn't set out to do anything dangerous and definitely doesn't do anything that I think is incredibly harmful, but that's one thing that I wasn't like the biggest fan of. I did end up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. I am going to continue with the series, and I can see why everyone loves it because it really is cute and adorable. But I hate Mia's grandmother. I would rather have Julie Andrews as the grandmother in this case because she's way better. The next book that I read was Far From You by Tess Sharpe, and this is amazing, guys. This is another one of those books where I'm going to have one of those 5 reasons you should read because it was so good. It follows a main character named Sophie who is trying to figure out who murdered her best friend and set her up to be responsible for it, because everyone thinks that the only reason her best friend was murdered was because Sophie set up a drug deal that went bad. And after Sophie was forced into rehab, she comes back and she is trying to figure out who set her up and who killed her best friend. This was just the perfect mystery thriller. I don't have anything bad to say about this book. It was so good. There was such great representation with a main character who is bisexual, has a substance use disorder and a disability, and just seeing all those identities intersect in this character, it was just done so perfectly. I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars and loved it so much. Definitely a book I need to own in my personal collection. Next, I read The Rose and the Dagger by Renee Ahdieh. This is the sequel to The Wrath and the Dawn, so not going to talk about it too much because of spoilers, but I will say that I really enjoyed the conclusion to this duology. If you enjoy really romantic plot lines and just kind of swoony romance and just a really big focus on couples, this is a duology you have to check out. I felt like the romance was done so perfectly, and then the conclusion of this duology was so satisfying. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I picked up Locomotion by Jacqueline Woodson. Had no idea this was yet another novel written in verse, and it was fantastic. I recently read Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson, which was a memoir written in verse, and it was beautiful. And Locomotion is no exception. I really enjoyed that this book challenges white privilege. I think that it is so important for children to have books like this. Number one, for children who need that representation, they can identify with this character so well. And then for children like me when I was growing up, so I could learn to challenge my white privilege and recognize that it's there. This book follows a main character named Lonnie, and he is in foster care, and it just follows his narrative through verse and how he sees the world as a child growing up in foster care, and it was so beautiful. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I picked up was The Reader by Traci, Chee, and this book is the first book in a fantasy series. This book follows a main character named Sophia, and her storyline is obviously the most important out of all of them, but it is a multi-perspective book, and there's a lot of really great world building in this book. This is a very dense first book in a series. There's so much world building, so many character introductions, and there's a lot of build-up of the lore of the world. It took me a while to dig through this book, and I found myself having to really reread passages. It was just, it's a pretty dense, heavy novel. Next, I picked up Pax by Sara Pennypacker. I listened to this on audiobook. This is a middle grade novel that follows a fox and his boy after they are separated, and it focuses on them coming together and trying to find each other. I felt like this was such a cute, beautifully written story. I loved the themes and discussions on war and destruction and how people can get caught up in those things. And I felt like this was going to be a solid 4 or 5 star read for me until the end, which I felt like was too abrupt, and I didn't feel like I had a lot of closure personally. So I ended up going with a 3.5 out of 5 stars because the ending just cut off too quickly, and I I don't know how I feel now. I also picked up You Know Me Well by David Levithon and Nina LaCour. I really wanted to pick this up a while back when it first came out because I loved Nina LaCour's other book that I read from her, Everything Leads to You. It was just perfect, beautiful, contemporary, and I found that I really enjoyed bits and pieces of this book, but I felt like it was a little scattered. I think that it was definitely a fun contemporary. There were really cute moments, there were really surreal moments for the characters, and I think that overall it was a pretty great contemporary, but I found myself only really liking the beginning and the end, and then the middle portions I wasn't loving quite as much. I don't know, I just felt like the way that the authors wrote the beginning and the end with the setting of the Pride Parade in San Francisco was just beautifully done and very entrancing and just really pulled me in. But then the middle parts just felt, I don't know, it just felt kind of flat for me. So I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. Next book that I picked up was Serafina and the Twisted Staff by Robert Beatty, and I really loved this. This is the sequel to Serafina and the Black Cloak, so again, can't say too much because spoilers, but this does follow our main character Serafina again, and she is such a cute cinnamon squish character, and I love her, and I love this storyline and the world and the dark magic that's written into it in this very beautiful, whimsical setting. It is just perfect and is an excellent Halloween read, which Halloween's over now, but there's always next year, or you could just pick it up now if you want to. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. I also read Through the Woods by Emily Carroll, and this is a graphic novel, and it was so creepy good. Especially the last 2 stories, I felt like they were so well done, and I actually had some trouble going to sleep after I finished reading it because I was really spooked. But this is such a good graphic novel, and it has this really nice eerie quality, and I like how the author doesn't try to draw conclusions for you. She kind of lets your imagination roll a little bit, which is always really excellent with any type of horror or scary situation, because my imagination is much more powerful than anything someone could make up, because when the lights go out I just become terrified. 4 out of 5 stars. And then I picked up Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling, and I really don't have to say anything about this book because I feel like everyone and their mom has read it, but I love it. I'm doing a Harry Potter reread, and this book got 5 out of 5 stars because it's magic, and I love it. And the last book that I picked up this month, hallelujah, we're at the end of this wrap-up, which I feel like if you're still here at this point, like, thank you, because this has taken forever. But the final book that I read this month was The Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury. I just wanted to pick this up because it was Halloween and I felt like it was appropriate and it was a classic. So I picked it up. And it was pretty interesting. I liked that this book didn't have one specific main character. It just follows a group of boys who go out trick-or-treating on Halloween and then get pulled into this devious plot where they have to save their friend Pipkin, and they go through different time periods and look at how others celebrated Halloween, and then they come back to their time period and have to like make an evil trade to save their friend Pipkin, and it was pretty interesting. I was not the biggest fan of the writing. I don't know if there's just something about the way Ray Bradbury writes, but it doesn't click with me. I have to reread sentences so many times to kind of garnish what they're trying to tell me, and this book took a little longer than it should have because it was only like 150 something pages. It took me the entire evening to read. So there was that. I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. I think it's a fantastic Halloween read, and if you're looking for something for next year, I definitely recommend sticking this on your TBR. Anyway, that has been it for today's video. I know this was probably like such a long wrap up. I dread editing it, but you gotta do what you gotta do. Thank you so much for watching. I'll leave links in the down bar below for you guys to check out my other social media sites such as Goodreads, Instagram, and Twitter. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Stay weird.